Hey everyone, so I've just watched an interesting episode of What Would You Do, the series on ABC, which I made another video about. This one was about a domestic violence situation. A girl and her partner, her boyfriend, in a sort of diner, eatery, something like that. And he's being very aggressive, not actually physical there and then, but just sort of makeup on to make it look like she's being abused, and sort of shows the reaction of passers-by. I've mentioned this is a very interesting series. This is a good episode, so I put a link to it in this video. Check it out. But I just want to share some of my thoughts on the situation. So basically, what happens is they put on this act. The guy gets sort of angry. One of the segments sort of says, that was a nasty fall you had, make sure the house is tidy next time and this won't happen, that sort of thing. So the implication is obvious. Now interestingly, in this clip, all the people who intervene are men, and quite big guys at that. They look like, rugby players. They look like big tough guys, and they're all quite shit. Well, not all, I should say. There's one guy that doesn't get involved. I'll speak about his position in a second, but quite a number of the guys are quite chivalrous to get involved, if that's the right word to use. They get involved. They don't, and some of them even talk about bringing it outside with the guy, and they're clearly quite concerned. One guy phones police. One guy says you don't speak to ladies like that, and so on. And the guy that doesn't get involved, he explains his rationale in that it wasn't his place. So there's mixed responses, but most of them are interventionists, so to speak. Anyway, I came across one of the comments below, which was quite interesting, and it's actually prompted me to make this video. The comment was, basically a guy had said he'd been in this position a few times. He had stepped in, and what happens, this was his experience, was that the woman just makes excuses for the abusive boyfriend. It actually defends him and turns on the would-be saviour, and just goes back to the abuser. And I think that brings about a lot of the psychology of these sort of relationships. So he was saying he can understand why people, especially men, don't get involved, because they get no thanks for it, and it's counterproductive anyway, because the woman just goes back to these scumbags in the first place. But I think there's several points to I can see where he's coming from. I haven't personally been in this situation, but I have seen examples of it, whereby guys have tried to do the right thing. Well, I'll give an example actually. My own father once saw a woman who, it's not quite the same, it's not quite domestic violence, but it is a damsel in distress phenomenon, or situation I should say. A woman looked like she'd just been mugged. My father thought he was doing the right thing, so he pulled over, asked if she was alright. He ended up getting mugged by a group of men. She'd basically been used as a distraction. The woman was fine, she was part of this gang. Now I'm not saying it's the same situation, but I'm just using that as an example whereby we cannot absolutely know what the response would be. So my father obviously thought he was doing the right thing, trying to help this young woman, and in the end she just turned out to be a distraction for the gang to carjack him, and luckily he escaped with relatively minor injuries, but he did get his car stolen. Anyway, I just cite that. It's not connected with domestic violence, but I just cite it as an example of how we cannot know absolutely what the response would be. And I think it is fair to say there are domestic violence situations where men get involved, and the woman will just end up defending the scumbag of a boyfriend that she is with. Now, one of the common criticisms of these situations, and not just from men, from women as well, is that these women bring it on themselves because they end up going back to the abusive relationship. Now, hear me out before you rush to judgment on that. I think it's very important to understand that these women are, I say women, I should say men as well, in the interest of fairness. You do get men who are victim of domestic violence, and actually some people will say, oh, why don't they make a video showing women victims? But I think they're just being realistic. Personally, I do believe that most victims of domestic violence are women, so this is just a realistic video. I don't think it's meant to be against male victims of violence. It's just, and to be fair, there was a video a while back done on public reactions to a woman abusing a man, and that's not cool. It's not cool that people ignore that or trivialise it. But anyway, that's I don't want to go off too much on a tangent. Let's just focus for now on female victims for now. So it can be a double-edged sword. Of course, there's the other risk that people get involved and the scumbag partner then takes it out on the girl, the woman, at home. Now, these men are violent anyway. What's to stop them, though, them thinking, oh, you've told these men, or even if she hasn't, quite often these are very paranoid people. What's to stop intervention actually making it worse? Now, speaking for myself, I despise men who use violence against women. I hate them. And I believe I would be the sort of guy who would intervene. I've not been in that situation, so I don't know how I would react. I would like to think I'd be the sort of person who would intervene. I'd like to think that would be my principles, but I just don't know because I haven't been in the situation. So it's hard to know, really. Like I say, quite often these women are manipulated. It's a power drive. I remember Family Guy done a sketch where they received quite a lot of criticism for that, for being too realistic, whereby they showed the abusive boyfriend and he sort of said to the battered girl, battered wife, oh, I'm correcting you. And she bought into that. And this is quite often the problem. These women are brainwashed into believing that they are at fault and they deserve the abuse. It's all a power drive, and it's very psychological. It's not just physical, it's also very psychological. And these scumbags know how to manipulate their victims. They know how to make the victims believe that it's their fault. So when people criticize these women for not seeking help, I think they're making a complex situation black and white. The rights and wrongs of it aren't complex. I mean, in my book, violence against women is wrong. That's that. But what I mean by complex is saying it's easy for these women to make a choice is not. It's not fair, because it isn't that easy. They're brainwashed. They're manipulated. Now, I think if children are involved, they have a responsibility to take some actions, especially if the husband is also abusive to the children or the boyfriend. And the same applies to an abusive mother. But in terms of boyfriend-girlfriend situations, we shouldn't assume that it's an easy choice to make. There could be other factors. It could be that he's giving her financial stability, and she's putting up with this abusive relationship because she sees it as at least stable. It's abusive, but it's stable. Maybe she's a lonely person. And these people are very clever at using manipulation techniques. It could be the next day he makes a grovelling apology and promises he'll never do it again, and he buys her presents and something, and it's quite easy to manipulate vulnerable people. And that doesn't mean these women are necessarily weak. It doesn't mean they're submissive, or they're not necessarily weak people. It's just a case that they're being manipulated by someone who's very, very skilled at manipulation. And this is a power game. Of course it's easy from the outside to say, oh, they're better off without these guys, or, well, they just go back, so what's the point? But I think it's important to understand the psychological side of it. Partly it's security. These women feel that they have security with these guys, which of course to a lot of outsiders that's perverse thinking, because how can someone who abuses you provide security, but it might be financial security. It could be a lot of things. So we shouldn't judge these women too much and sort of think, well, they bring it on, or they enjoy being victims or something, because the truth is probably a lot more complex. So going back to the video, I can understand why the first guy doesn't get involved. It doesn't mean he's a coward or he's a bad guy or anything like that. It's just that he perhaps thought that it would make things worse. We can't judge that man. We can't sort of think he's not a good guy just because he doesn't get involved. Personally, I'd probably be more inclined to be the sort of guy that intervenes. Maybe not to the extent of the guy who, you know, talks about bringing it outside. I think personally my own stance would be something like the guys, and if you watch the video you see what I mean, who try to rationalise with him, like tell him to calm down, that sort of thing. I don't think I'd maybe go to the extent of the guy who talks about bringing it outside, and I'm not 100% sure if that's the right approach either. I mean, certainly scumbags who abuse women, in my book, they deserve to be levelled by a man. I do believe that, but I'm not sure it would necessarily make the situation better. There's no excuses for their behaviour. There's probably reasons for it. It could be that they had an abusive mother, or they're suffering alcohol problems or whatever. There's always reasons for these things, but you know, talking about a reason isn't the same as an excuse. So by saying that, I'm certainly not giving them excuses. But you know, you're not born a scumbag. You're not like that for nothing. So men like this have a responsibility to get themselves help if they know they have an anger problem, if they know they have a violence problem. They're adults. They have a responsibility to do something about it. So they can't make excuses. If it is a case that they had an abusive mother, it's still no excuse. If you're a guy who's like that and you're watching this video, well, you're not going to get much sympathy from me, but I would say one thing: do yourself a favour, get help. Just what's the point of ending up in prison or ending up levelled by another man, which by the way you deserve? But you know, get help yourself. It's quite obvious these guys aren't particularly happy either. They're very paranoid and angry, so it's an unhappy situation all around. But as a man, I have total contempt for other men who use violence against women. I personally think that I'd be somewhere in the middle in terms of, and that's not sitting on the fence, it's trying to judge what's the best approach. I'd probably be like the guys who intervene and challenge him vocally, not necessarily physically like the guy in the red top. And I'm not criticising his approach necessarily, and I'm not criticising the first guy's approach. I'm just saying, like, sometimes it is genuinely hard to know what's right. Now, it could be that as a fellow man, your instinct might take over and you'd be compelled to be the white knight, as someone put it, and you'd want to level the guy. But you have to ask, is that necessarily going to make things better? Sure, he deserves it, but what happens then if the woman just turns on you and says, you know, what if that situation happens? And then she just goes back with him anyway. So all you've done is got into a physical altercation, you've got no thanks for it. And you haven't helped the woman, she just went back anyway. So the point is, it is sometimes hard to know what the best approach is. So it's a thought-provoking video, it's an interesting video. That's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on this. I'd be particularly interested in hearing from male viewers what you would do. I don't think it's a simple black and white situation, but by all means check out the video. And just one last thing, I know the video is focusing on a woman, and I'm focusing on women victims in this video. That's by no means, you know, I'm already expecting some guys will come on here and say, oh, what about male victims? I'm not saying there isn't male victims of domestic violence, but we're just focusing on the situation. By all means, you know, I could make a response to the other video that shows a woman victim of domestic violence. But anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.